Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the UN General Assembly here in New York City. I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex, and we are continuing our ongoing coverage on the sidelines of this important annual gathering here in New York. And like everything else we've been covering here at the General Assembly, everything this year is colored, of course, by the COVID pandemic. We're here to talk about a very specific issue around digital inclusion. It's an event that's brought to you by Devex and our partners at AARP. But even though this event is about digital inclusion, I think we can all connect to it by thinking through what the pandemic has meant for us when it comes to connectivity. I mean, first of all, we all learn that connectivity is pretty fundamental to living a modern life in this world. And if you don't have access, especially when you're locked down or you're home, boy, it's hard. It's hard to succeed in school. It's hard to succeed in work and in life in general. So connectivity, I think, really rose to the forefront. It's a topic many people are talking about here at the General Assembly. We're here to talk about a particular element of it, something that I think many of us also experience, especially as older people in our lives, grandparents or parents or aunts and uncles and friends tried to access the vaccine in their own countries. And I've heard this from many people in different countries around the world, the process of registering for an appointment online, figuring out how it all works, getting valid information, a lot of that was challenging. And what we want to talk about is when we have this discussion around connectivity, how do we make sure it's an inclusive discussion, including older people? What are the opportunities, the challenges, the barriers, but also what are the solutions? And ARP has worked with us to put together really the world's leading experts on the key issues around digital inclusion for older people. And so I think we're all, including me, going to learn a lot today in this session, and we're really delighted to make this part of our overall coverage here at the UN General Assembly in the 76th year. I want to mention that at the end of the event, you will get to hear from one of the executives at AARP, and that's Allison Bryant. And Allison's a Senior Vice President of Research and the Enterprise Lead for Technology and Digital Equity at AARP. So I'm looking forward to her thoughts after we conclude our panel. And we're beginning now with some comments that I think are going to help kick us off and really frame the conversation that we'll have in our panel of experts in a moment. We're going to be hearing from Maria Francesca Spatosolano, who is the officer in charge at the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. Maria Francesca is also an Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at the UNDESA. And in her personal capacity, she's taken on this additional role as the officer in charge of the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. So she's really working at the forefront of this very issue, and we're delighted to get a chance to hear directly from her on this topic. Maria Francesca.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Mr. Kumar, for your welcoming remarks. Over the past years, Devex's commitment to spotlight population aging issues was remarkable. You have used your global media platform to address the realities, contributions, diverse needs, and challenges faced by older persons. And of course, AARP is the perfect partner for this event. AARP's long-standing role in advocating with governments, businesses, and civil society to champion the interests of older persons has been extremely important. I speak to you wearing two hats. Firstly, my role as Assistant Secretary General of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, where I oversee the UN analytical work on social development, including on older persons. And secondly, as the officer in charge of the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution characterized by rapid digital innovation, including robotics and artificial intelligence, that will affect all sectors of society, as well as the way we live, the way we work, and how we relate to each other. This trend has become even clearer during the COVID-19 pandemic, as so many activities have been transferred online and take place virtually. As we face new risks and many opportunities in this increasingly digitalized era, the United Nations has risen to the challenge, putting forward last year a bold vision of the digital future the world needs in the Secretary General's Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, and now reinforced it in his Common Agenda, released on Friday, 10th of September this year. In these efforts to forge a more open, free, and secure digital future for all, we must make sure that older persons are not left behind. You know it, our dependence on digital technologies increases constantly. While these technologies have become ubiquitous in the economic and social life of both developed and developing countries, there are still stark digital divides, both between and among countries. Globally, women are around 10% less likely to be online compared to men. And for older persons, they experience digital inequity to a greater extent than other groups in society. This is because they either lack access to technologies or are often not benefiting fully from the opportunities provided by technological progress. Even here in the United States, one of the most developed countries in the world, over 40% of the country's over 65 population does not have access to broadband internet. But as countries' populations age around the world, it is becoming more and more urgent that we address this issue of digital inclusion for the elderly. There are three reasons why this is critical, and they have to do with accessibility, with the new way we work, and last but not least, with our personal life. Firstly, today, using digital tools is a prerequisite for the access to basic services. Telehealth and telemedicine, for example, offer a wide range of applications, from digital information and advice to video consultations and health promotion and prevention apps for self-monitoring of chronic diseases. This is of utmost importance, especially in underserved areas. Providers using telehealth and telemedicine need to integrate and address the digital divide affecting many older persons, so that digital disparities do not reinforce regional, social, and health inequalities. We have all seen, for instance, how during the initial vaccine rollouts in different countries, older people faced greater difficulties receiving the COVID vaccine because they were less able to get online to find information or book appointments. Secondly, the past decade has witnessed gains in the labor force participation rate of older persons, albeit with significant variations between countries and between older men and women. Still, as a result of the pandemic, unemployment has risen sharply. Supporting longer working lives in the face of ageism and post-pandemic vulnerabilities will require targeted measures, including addressing the digital gap that currently affects many older persons. This way, we can empower them to continue professional or economic activities in evolving economic markets. Thirdly, we need to better understand the impact that digital technologies may have on the rights and experiences of older people. So far, studies have shown how artificial intelligence can lead to discriminatory impacts based on gender or race. But little information is available on older persons. We should consider if such possible biases in AI algorithms against the elderly might exacerbate the exclusion of older people and the digital divide, and how to prevent new biases in the system. Events such as this one are an important opportunity to draw attention to these issues and to have much needed discussions. Please count on the United Nations to be a key partner for all of you in this. Within DESA, our Division for Inclusive Social Development continues its efforts to promote the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging through partnerships, advocacy, and policy development. I also look forward to the continuing collaboration between AARP and the Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Technology to implement the Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation and his common agenda. In line with this, we will continue the conversation through another event on the 1st of October during the United Nations International Day of Older Persons, where the theme is Digital Equity for All Ages. In conclusion, looking ahead, there is much that we still do not know about how the digital revolution will unfold, how its potential, good and bad, will materialize in the next decades. But in all of this, we must ensure that older persons remain a priority and that their voices are heard. I look forward to working closely with all of you to this end. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Maria Francesca. That message was very well received, especially the fact that this is a priority issue for the Secretary General and the UN. You know, it's one of these issues that requires a lot more conversation and attention and understanding in order to really address it. And that's really why we at Devex and AARP are putting this event on today. And it's fantastic to have you help us get it started. Let me now welcome our panel of experts, and we're going to dig much deeper into this question of digital inclusion for older people. So I'll ask them to turn on their videos, and as they do that, I'm just going to tell you who we're all joined by. It really is a collection of experts across the many issues that you just heard about. We have with us, let's see, Tom Camber is with us, the Executive Director of Older Adults Technology Services, or OATS. We have Frances West, who is the former Chief Accessibility Officer at IBM, one of the top executives at that company, and now founders her own organization, Frances West Co. We have Dr. Matthias von Schwanenflügel, who is the Director General of the Division of Demographic Change for Older People and Welfare in the Federal Ministry of Family Affairs, Senior Citizens, Women and Youth in Germany. And we have Lourdes Montenegro, who is the lead for the digital sector transformation at the World Benchmarking Alliance. So it's really a collection of people who know a lot about this topic and work on this topic every day. And I thought maybe we could just try to get into the discussion by understanding what is the actual challenge in front of us. I hear a lot in the global development sector about connectivity, hear more about it due to the pandemic, people talking about, for example, children and not being in school and needing access to the internet. What is the lens on this when it comes to older people? What is the actual issue at hand here that we need to get into? And maybe I can start with you, Tom, since this is something you're working on every day.
Sure, and thank you, Raj, for having us today. Really excited to be participating. I think the biggest challenge in terms of connectivity in older adults, certainly from the United States point of view, still remains connectivity to the home for people to have broadband or high-speed connections. About 40% of older Americans don't have broadband at their home, and so they're really required, they have to go to the library or their neighbor's house to get good connections. And in many cases, the connections are expensive. They have a hard time affording it. And also for people that are on the older side of the age spectrum, a lot of people are still looking for the value justification. They're used to the television and the telephone, and maybe they have a smartphone that's working well enough. The pandemic has led to a lot more people engaging in technology purchases and taking the plunge to go online, but we still have a long way to go. And there are 20 million Americans that don't have connections, and we don't have a really coordinated national strategy yet.
And this kind of falls under the bucket of infrastructure, right? That in many parts of the world, it might be that there is no infrastructure for connectivity in certain places. In others, it might be the infrastructure is there, but it's really expensive and people can't afford it. Obviously, you have the 5G revolution happening in many places, and that may help address this. But maybe we can stay on this theme of infrastructure for a second. Matthias, I see you nodding your head, and I wonder if you want to jump in on this point as well. When you think of this issue of connectivity for older people, what it means. And you're muted.
Thank you very much, Raj, and thank you for the question. I think when we talk about this, we have to talk about barriers as well. And I see, especially in Germany, I see a lack of implementation of the principle of lifelong learning so that elderly people can cope up with the new technology. We must understand that the right to quality education does not stop with having fulfilled primary and secondary education. It even does not stop after tertiary education and apprenticeship. Lifelong learning also means skills development, especially for the elderly, throughout the life cycle. Figures from the EU Fundamental Rights Agency also show clearly that there is a noticeable gender divide in the older generation regarding digital skills, often due to choice taken earlier in life. So we must really implement the SDG 4 for all persons and leave no one behind. And I would like to point out, I would like to suggest to raise this issue also within the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Aging as one of the gaps we should close in the future for older persons.
Yeah, so that kind of falls in this bucket of digital literacy, right? And our older people learning about how to use these technologies. And you make a great point. One reason maybe people aren't is that society is not promoting the idea that you learn your whole life. This is not, education is not limited to younger people. It's not limited to one phase of life. Maybe Francis, we can go to you. You worked at one of the world's biggest technology companies in a leadership role. You rose up through the ranks there. When you think of this challenge, how would you frame it up, the challenge of digital inclusion for older people?
Well, I think both Tom and Matthias talked about, there's definitely our current challenges, which is the tactical challenges, for example, learning or infrastructure investment. But at the same time, I think that there is actually a perception and perspective challenge in that a lot of times we think about aging population as others versus us, right? Especially from the business perspective, we tend to segment, population. As you know, right now, even though the topic of inclusion is very in, we kind of go from, okay, GLBT to Black Lives Matters to women and all that. But one population that cut across all these quote unquote discrete, kind of focus is people, and aging is one of the, just fundamental life experience that we all going to have. But because of this universal, sometimes actually we lose the perspective of how important it is. And therefore, it actually affects the investment or the prioritization. So I think in order to address this lack of, in this case, of translating into lack of focus, that we actually have to elevate our whole understanding of this topic as what I call the human first topic. And I think earlier, the Assistant Secretary General Francesca mentioned we're in the fourth industrial revolution, where all the technology, whether it's artificial intelligence, it's very personalized technology, very different from the 1970 or 80 when I first joined IBM, which is a mainframe big computer for the system optimization. Now we're talking about personal, individual optimization. So from that perspective, building in, experience or design for the human advocacy or literacy, it's a must do. I think in general, as collective team, both with the UN, AARP, and your organization, we actually have the responsibility to reset the thinking and reset the priority and perspective here.
Yeah, I mean, you're really bringing a rights dimension to this question, right? There is certainly ageism in the United States and many countries around the world. And in some ways, it's still like an accepted form of discrimination, right? It doesn't get talked about as much. And while we might be talking about what sounds like a technical issue around connectivity, is the infrastructure there? Or is there a lifelong learning program? You're saying fundamentally there's a rights issue here. And if we don't respect the rights of older people,
Right. There is a right and there's a perspective issue. I don't necessarily want to jump to a rights because a lot of times it has more of a negative connotation. I think sometimes we haven't been thinking through hard enough. But if you want to equate that in the ultimate case, it is a human right. It is a foundational human issue.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point. I'm glad you're putting it on the table. I'm going to go in a moment to Lourdes, but before I do that, I want to mention to all of you who are following along, we really want to hear from you. And so I want to pose a question to you. We've so far been kind of framing the problem, but I'd like your help in thinking about examples of solutions. And I don't want you to post anything yet in the chat, but start working on it, start writing it out. When we finish hearing from Lourdes, I will tell you when, and we're going to get kind of a blizzard of responses from everyone at once. Examples where you see something working to address this issue of digital inclusion for older people. It can be any specific example you've got. Start thinking about it, start typing it out. Don't press send yet. And Lourdes, I want to get you into the discussion now. In terms of framing this for us, how do you see the challenge of digital inclusion for older people?
Thanks, Raj. Great to be here. You hit the nail on the head when you mentioned rights. And then you also mentioned solutions just now. So I'm going to combine those two because I come from a more corporate accountability angle. Our work at the World Benchmarking Alliance is really around making sure that business contributes to sustainable development. And of course, the rights of older persons and digital inclusion is part and parcel of all of that. When we frame it, we think of digital inclusion really as something rather broad. It goes beyond access. It's not just connectivity per se. It's also about skills, as Dr. Matthias has mentioned. But beyond that, there's also a question of trust. Is there a consideration, a perception that technology or the institutions providing the technology are trustworthy in terms of respect for basic human rights, privacy, cybersecurity, protection from all sorts of risks and harms? And finally, there's also the issue of the ability to participate in the innovative process itself, to be included in the design of technology, to be considered in that design. So when we think of inclusion, we can actually think about inclusion around these 4 areas: access, skills, use, and innovation. But I'd like to throw a wrench into our conversation as well, and
Please
also think about inevitability. Is when you think about right to what? Is it really that digitalization is so inevitable that we are powerless to stop the tide, that people do not have the option to be non-digital if they choose to do so, which many older persons might choose to do so? And that's something that we also need to respect and provide an option for. But instead, what we see are the situations where older people get difficulty accessing healthcare, vaccines, because the designers of systems just assume that the process is digital, that it's inevitable, that it is the right of the newer generations to just, open the tide to something that might not be the preference of everyone. So we can also broaden our thinking around that, I suppose. And when you think about solutions, it's also staring us right in the face. There's the problem and also the solution in the business sector. So part of the solution is really to increase the accountability, to improve the performance of the business sector, especially the digital technology sector, around these issues, around considering the needs and rights of older persons and on all vulnerable groups.
There's a lot there, Lourdes, that we should unpack in terms of how do you hold these businesses accountable? How do you make sure they care about these older people as consumers? You put on the table this idea of inclusive design. So we heard at first from Tom, we heard about this broad concept about infrastructure. Again, it has affordability as part of it, devices, connectivity, the internet, those are all part of that conversation. We also heard about the idea of digital literacy. And now you're adding to the table this concept of inclusive design, which gets to Francis' point about rights. Because ultimately, if you care about somebody, you ask what they think. and how the product or the service can be designed to serve their needs. If you don't actually think about them, you don't put them at the center of your design process, and you say, well, it's up to you if you use my product or service, and if you don't, it's fine. You're not my focus. And so I think ultimately these do come back to a rights question. Before we go any further into solutions, I want to give everyone who's following along a chance. So hopefully by now you've thought of a specific example of a solution, something you've seen that works in this area of digital inclusion for older people. I'd like you to have it in your chat box. And when I say go, press send. We're going to just see a blizzard of these things, and we'll review them as we talk. Go. I'm looking at the chat button to see if the numbers are scrolling up. Keep it coming. And as these come in, we're going to just continue the discussion. I'm going to go to you, Tom, because you did a good job kind of framing up for us some of the challenges, right? The 40% of people don't have access to the internet, even in an advanced economy like here. So what are some of these solutions you're seeing that try to get at this issue? And maybe we can just start specifically with the infrastructure issue. What are some of the solutions you're seeing, Tom?
There's a couple of different levels of solutions. First of all, from the community level, where we've been doing most of our work at Oates, there are nonprofits all over the country that are retooling to help people grapple with this digital challenge that they have. So New York City has over 200 senior centers. And when COVID occurred, they reinvented the way that they were working with people and started helping older adults get online, helping people train to use Zoom, helping people use digital tools to get home delivered meals and things. So the United States has a pretty robust sector of nonprofit, voluntary, and other organizations that are similar, and they're really making a difference there. So that's one piece of the puzzle. It's very adaptive, and it tends to come with what we call cultural competency, because not every older adult comes from the same background or environment. And so people that come from different walks of life or ethnicities or income levels can really engage with their local community service organizations and make a difference. At the other end of the spectrum, it's government, and government can really help set policy, set direction, put effective regulation on the telecommunications industry. So one of the things that we're looking at these days is getting the large telecommunications companies to provide low-cost services to people. And for the first time ever in the United States, we now have a subsidy that's helping low-income people get access to the internet. It's a $50 a month subsidy during the period of COVID, which is a strategy that I know they've employed in places like South Korea, but it's something that we've recently adopted here, and it seems to be getting some real traction. And AARP has been really active in advocating for that and making it come to pass.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of digital connectivity as an essential service, like you would think about having access to food or heat in the winter or electricity, then of course it should be something that's regulated and supported and subsidized. What's your take on this, Francis? Again, thinking about how critical these issues are, you brought up kind of the rights perspective. What's your take on some solutions you've seen that are starting to get at these challenges?
I think if we, like we talked about, if we start thinking about this as really kind of a human, I guess you can say human rights or the human issue, from the business perspective, especially technology business, which I worked in my whole life in, is that we're beginning to see how we can augment the human ability with technology, but not presuming that technology is the answer to all, right? So one example I can think of is in one of the most interesting projects that I was involved in. It was when IBM and Apple came together and created an application in Japan for the postal officers when they deliver mail to check on the well-being of the elderly. Because you think about it, in the society of Japan, the aging is number one. I think they're the oldest country in the world now. But so how do you make use of technology to help with the well-being? And then, and so in this case, it's a beautiful case of a technology design in such a way that is very easy to understand, easy for the postal officer who's delivering mail, to be able to use the iPad to address the needs of the checking on the elderly. So I think that's a beautiful example of a human-centered design coming in using technology, but understand the access point or the access channel in this case potentially actually is optimized with the human participation. So I think in general, I agree with Lotus and all the comment that we really have to think more holistically in this whole thinking, and not presume that technology will do it all. And because if we actually take that perspective, we potentially will lose out because the literacy, because, or just the kind of a psychological readiness of our elderly population.
Yeah, I think that connects so well to Lourdes's point that we shouldn't force the technology on people. If somebody wants to be able to access the service without it, maybe they want to speak with their postman and provide the information that way, that they should be able to. And that's a great way to use it, to think of technology as an enabler. Matthias, maybe I can come to you to get your thoughts. What would you like to add so far to the discussion as we start to think about solutions?
Yeah, thinking about solutions, we had a so-called government report on older persons that dealt with the challenges in the issue of older persons and digitalization in Germany. And it was published last year. The findings of this report, I would like to share with you the main findings. First, as we talked about, older persons must be at the center of the federal government strategy and in the general discussion on digitalization. And I mean, we talked about companies having new devices for older people, and we must see older people, they don't have that much time to cope up or to learn with how to deal with these little gadgets. Younger people, for them, it's no problem. But for older people, they say, well, if I don't get on with it, I won't use it. So we have to have that in mind. And second, relevant professions like nurses must make use of digitalization. We often see that they do not. And in favor of older people, especially people in need of long-term care, for instance, they have to use digitalization to get connected with hospitals, with...
I think we may have lost you for a moment there, Matthias, but I think the point you were getting at, which is so important, it kind of connects to Francis' example of postal workers, right? Is the nurses, being connected, and maybe the older person themselves aren't using the technology, but they're giving information back to a nurse who's then connecting it to the broader health system. Lourdes, why don't we why don't we come to you, Lourdes, as Matthias works on his connection, and just ask you for your take on solutions. We had a few came in, and in fact, a few interesting questions have come in that I'm going to get to in a moment, but I just want to see if you have any reaction to what you've heard so far, Lourdes.
I've really been enjoying the suggestions in the chat. Actually, people are really getting creative with all sorts of solutions out there. One of the things that we are currently doing as an organization is essentially to provide the visibility and transparency so that all of us from different organizations globally, whether we're governments, we're investors, civil society groups like ARP, can call to account what the tech sector is doing and what it's focusing on. So we provide a free and publicly available benchmark of 200 of the world's largest tech companies out there, from Adobe to Zoom, including the platform that we are currently on. And we hope that that could be part of the solution. When we measure something, it matters. So data is very important, and unfortunately, data is very lacking in terms of our efforts to build more digital inclusion. So there's not a lot of visibility. And I mean, just to share from some of our indicators on our benchmarks, it's like a preview. This is not yet final. We're launching on December 7th, so watch out. A lot of the efforts that the companies are putting into are mostly on basic skills. They have a lot of initiatives that look at basic skills for the elderly. Surprisingly, we don't see yet a lot of the North American tech companies having a lot of initiatives for the elderly population. So maybe that's something that AARP can work on in the future. There's definitely an opportunity there. What we do see is a lot of Asian companies, and that could be cultural. There's a lot of aging in that part of the world. There's a cultural, desire to be respectful towards your elders. So there's a lot of Asian companies doing all sorts of projects targeted for the elderly. But surprisingly, not a lot of the efforts are folded into their efforts in innovation, in building trustworthy technology, in even in access. A lot of it is in skills. So we're seeing that there might be areas where the sector can definitely contribute more on.
Yeah, and it sounds like a challenge there is making sure these efforts are mainstreamed into their core business, and it's not just kind of a check the box activity. And that's even a challenge for organizations like yours, and why it's so important that you do what you do to create that accountability to say, well, it's not good enough that you say you have a pilot program on digital skills. What about your core product? In fact, we got a question in from Michael Scaff saying, can we establish better standards for universal design and technology so the UI UX better includes considerations for use across all age groups? And that would be an example, right, where it's not enough for a big tech company to say, well, we have a pilot program for skills if their core product doesn't have a UI and a UX that works for older people. Francis, I saw you nodding. Love to hear your take.
Yeah, I mean, I want to actually follow up on the Laura's comment about, I think there's a tremendous innovation opportunity in this space. And it is true that some of the Asian countries, including, for example, China, is actually moving very fast and very aggressively in using technology to create new innovation for the elder population, partly because probably, for example, country of China will have 365 million elderly people. That's the entire population of the United States in 10, 15 years. So they have a very real tactical needs to begin to address that. But going back to AARP actually has undergoing some tremendous effort in the innovation space. I know that because I've been working with them a bit on this. And I would just say that in the startup world, that is absolutely a potential area for all of us can help to promote, and that we do see a lot of innovation, but hopefully it doesn't lead to what I call the popcorn innovation, which is people will come in with a good idea, good intention, but not really create a solution that's scalable. And going back to Tom's earlier point about, can it be a scalable and sustainable infrastructure technology solution? So I think those are the things that we see as a challenge, but also a tremendous open opportunity for all of us to work from.
Tom, go ahead. I think you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of points to that. And I really appreciate Lourdes throwing out this challenge about the collaborations or lack thereof with some of the corporate partners. We at Oates, when we started out as a small nonprofit here in New York City, we were lucky enough to be able to partner with quite a few companies to bring our expertise around older adults and aging to their corporate environments where they were trying to reach customers. And so we worked with Capital One on a project helping people access online banking training through high quality videos that were designed by older adults. We worked with Comcast, which is a big telecoms company. And eventually we got to the point where we're working with AARP. Of course, we're an affiliate now. AARP has a really cool project right now called the Age Tech Collaborative, which is really, I believe Francis maybe even is familiar with this, that is bringing entrepreneurial startups together that are focused in the aging world. We're all planning to go to CES this year, so people that are at CES should come visit the pavilion. And there's a lot of interest in that startup world and also in the more, I think, established tech companies in working with older populations, but we haven't met. In the US, at least, we're still making that case. AARP is the leader in this. Oates kind of bootstrapped our way up doing it. But I think there's a huge amount of potential collaboration and a lot of interest. It just hasn't been, we haven't closed those deals yet in the scale that I think you're talking about. But there's a huge opportunity right now.
Yeah, and scaling, as you say, there's two ways to do it. One is to go really local. And Tom, as you said earlier, lots of local organizations kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom, which is great for dealing with the very customized needs of individual communities. But when it comes to tech platforms, you really want to think about scale at a broader level. Matthias, maybe I can get you in on a question that came in from our audience, because your division that you direct deals with senior citizens, but also deals with women and youth. And the question that's come in is, I think involving youth in the solutions for digital inclusion for the elderly can be helpful at the community level. What does the panel think about this? Is it being done somewhere? Do you see any connection point here, Matthias?
Well, yeah, we have several little projects where we get together elderly people and young people, so that young people can help elderly people regarding digitalization, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, elderly people can help kids with their homework or whatever. So we try to get people together for the sake of the elderly to get used to their gadgets and to cope with the questions of digitalization. Because, I mean, as we talked about it, it's moving so fast that they have to keep up with this speed of the digitalization. That is not very easy.
Yeah, what I like about that as well, and it kind of gets to Francis's overarching view at the beginning of what's our perspective on this, is we should see this as a whole of society challenge, right? Not just something for one group of people. If everybody should be part of that solution, that's the only way you're going to get anywhere on it. You know, we have another
Raj,
question that came in. Yeah, go ahead, Francis.
No, I just want to make one more comment based on Mattia just said. I think one of the things is, and also earlier there was a question about, you know, are there any kind of standards and, you know, that we can help? I think there are actually emerging standards especially on the website. You know, the web consortium, World Wide Web Consortium has come up with design standards for both aging and also people with disabilities. And because as we age, we all acquire some kind of disability. So, and going back to the youth and also startup, there is actually a concerted effort to educate young, you know, engineers, a designer of design, inclusion by design standards and efforts. So again, it's at the beginning, but it's all pointing to there is a collective effort to make this more sustainable and scalable.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And you're right, that does connect a lot of these dots. You know, we did have someone who had a question. I want to encourage others to go ahead and keep putting your questions in. But someone had a question kind of pressing us a little bit on, are we really walking the talk? Are we listening enough to older people, including them enough in some of these ideas for what we should be doing to solve this challenge? What's your take? You all represent very different organizations, but maybe Lourdes, I see you nodding. And anything you can say about that? Like, for example, to what extent are you including older people or organizations that work with older people as you design the metrics that you'll use in your benchmarking?
That's a great question, Raj. We really try our best to reach out to all organizations who represent all sorts of vulnerable groups. And we are actually very happy to be in touch and collaborating with AIRP. And we hope to get a lot of feedback coming in on more metrics, actually. How do we measure companies? What matters? And if we put more of that, we already have it, but we can have more. The more the merrier. So we're very happy to accept input. So give it to us and let us know if you guys want to hold companies accountable to specific things. You have specific expectations. I mean, just to share, for example, when we did the first benchmark last year of 100 companies, we found that actually only 23 of them reported that they made any effort to ask feedback when they were designing some of their products from stakeholder groups of diverse backgrounds. And so that's quite alarming.
23 out of how many? Out of how many companies?
Of 100.
Wow. Okay.
And only 33 out of 100 reported that they were adhering to any accessibility design guidelines, let alone the design standards that Francis mentioned. So it's we're a long way there. There's a lot of ways to progress.
Yeah, Raj, can I add
absolutely
one more point to that?
Please, Tom. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a real brief addition here, which is that all inclusive design is not all created equal. And sometimes, you know, we've worked with companies that come in and say, well, you know, we've talked to some older adults about this, and then we'll dig a little deeper and say, well, what's your process for that? And they'll say, well, you know, I called my mom and, you know, she said to make the buttons bigger, and it just feels a little paternalistic or limited here. And then there are other organizations and companies that are really going deep and having real, you know, they hire people that are experts in collaborative design. I know IDEO has been really active in this. AARP has been really active. Also, company out of Israel, Intuition Robotics, really set the standard in one of my studies, looking at really involving older adults in really early stage design thinking, looking at some of the patterns of user experience that they're trying to get, and not being in any way kind of paternalistic with it, really being partners. And so that empowering side by side deep dive kind of work that needs to get done is where we need to go with this. And I think people need to be challenged. 23% of the people that they're interviewing say they're doing it at all, but you can go a little bit deeper and say, well, describe the process, and let's establish the best practices and showcase them. It's not about rapping people on the knuckles for doing it wrong. It's about saying, look how much more you can sell your product. Look how many more markets you can reach if you do an exemplary job of this. And that's what it looks like, and get people excited about it.
It sounds, Tom, like you have a feeling even that 23% number is a little high. In other words, if you actually looked under the hood of what's being done there, it might not all adhere to those best practices.
Let's say it's a good start. It's a start. And it really is. I mean, the fact that Lourdes is asking the question, the fact that people are filling out answers does get us engaged. And that's where we need to get started with it. But I think we have a little, we really need to accelerate this process, and we're ready to do it. People know how we know all the material is there. The information is there. It's a matter of getting engaged and getting people, building momentum and building some incentives.
Francis, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I would even go further than that. I think, obviously the design is really top of mind right now for many companies. But really to, at least because I'm coming from a kind of product and solution from a company, technology company perspective, you really want to have what we call sustained and scalable solutions. You got to make sure that you actually have the back-end testing and validation as well. And that's when we really need actual participation of the constituency that you're trying to serve. Let's say we're designing for older population. We really need to have the older population to test out the product or services, which a lot of times is missing. Now, the good news is that they are an organization, both for-profit or non-profit, beginning to emerging to create, for example, easier access to the population to do the testing and validation. But I think we really have to think about this entire process just like any other product development process, to think about the concept of design and the development and deployment, but then within that constant micro testing and micro validation. That's the only way that we can ensure that we end up with a product and services that's really usable and not just accessible.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's exact polar opposite of Tom's example of, ask your mom what she wants and make it bigger buttons or something. You're saying, no, integrate it completely in your product development process, just like you would any other core user
Correct.
group that you're trying to serve. That's a really important distinction. I wonder, as we think about this discussion, we focused a lot on the United States. We've had some examples of China, of Japan, of Germany. What do you think about lower income countries? In places where maybe the connectivity numbers are worse, the infrastructure is worse. How do you think about their challenges? Is it basically the same broad set of solutions, or is there some special consideration that needs to be taken? Tom, I'd like to get to you on that if I could.
Sure. I was just on a panel just a couple of years ago, visited Colombia and spent some time in Bogota and in some of the regional communities outside of Bogota. I actually went to a community that was like a housing settlement where they have a group of older adults that are taking technology classes in a converted shipping container. And we walked in and they said, "Oh, Tom Camper from New York. Yeah, we watch your stuff all the time. We're on Senior Planet. We love that site because we teach in Spanish and there's some back and forth there. But there's an intense desire in a lot of the communities. I was in Chile recently as well, and in their intense desire to Chile is more developed, but there was really momentum and excitement around doing this work. I think the thing to keep in mind here is that technology is when we think about technology, it should be a very broad net. Everybody is dealing with the connectivity opportunities that they have right now with the devices that they have with their physical environment. They may have limited access to electrical service and things like that. And so being able to adapt, the core concept here is being excited about aging and finding ways to use technology to advance the future of the aging agenda. And that's as active in Bogota, in that community, right in that space where we were working. People were working on entrepreneurship programs right there. They were building business ideas. They were doing videotaping of weddings and things like that. I met a group of Haredim women in a community outside of Jerusalem a few years ago that were also doing entrepreneurship with technology, but they don't use the internet because of the cultural issues, but they were doing economic development programming at the grassroots level with the technology that was available to them. So it's a really varying level of tech, but the concept of empowerment, what Matthias calls digital sovereignty, which I think is a wonderful concept, and that sense of being able to use the technology for people's kind of community-based visions of aging, I think is really available there. It goes across the globe.
Yeah, I love the way you're framing that, and I love the optimism behind it, the idea of looking for this as not a problem we need to solve, but actually a big opportunity in the world, right? If we can include more people and give them more access, it's a huge opportunity. Matthias, maybe you could say a word about this idea of digital sovereignty.
Well, I think what we do in Germany, we try to work together with the private sector, and we try to improve, with the help of the private sector, we try to improve the sovereignty of the elderly, and we launched a digital pact for the elderly the other day.
I think we're having a little bit of connectivity issues right here with you, Matthias. Unfortunately, we're not hearing you well, but we will come back to you. We will come back to you. We are kind of getting toward the end of our time as a panel. Believe it or not, it's going really quick. And so maybe we can use this as a moment to sort of frame up and kind of come to some closing thoughts from each of the three of you who are on screen. And then if Matthias is able to reconnect, we'll hear his closing thoughts and hear a little bit more about what he was trying to say. You know, we've touched on a lot of issues. We've touched on the infrastructure issues, the literacy issues, the inclusiveness issues, the overarching theme about rights and opportunity. You know, what is your big takeaway for people here? Again, we're at the outskirts of the UN General Assembly. For people who may not work on these issues every day like you all do, but who are now learning about it as part of this session and thinking, how can they connect to this issue? What thoughts do you have for them to take away? Maybe Lourdes, I can start with you.
Sure, I'll be very brief. It's just, we just need to think about it as good karma and good business sense to be digitally inclusive of older persons and of all vulnerable groups. As simple as that.
I love it. I love the idea of good karma. I think we might have Matthias back. So let's, while your connection is good, let's go to you for your closing thoughts. How do people who are not working on this every day as you are, how do they connect to this issue? What can they do to help drive this agenda?
Well, I think for the government, it is very important to work together with NGOs and civil society, because they know what people need, and they can help the people, and they can help the government to do the right thing. So working for governments, it is crucial that governments work together with the private sector on the one hand, and on the other hand, with NGOs and organizations like ARP.
Fantastic. And Francis, maybe we can go to you for some closing thoughts.
I think this is, I go back to my first point, which any of us who use technology, you know, we have to think about our connection, you know, through the technology is it to all, right? Of people of all age and all ability. And in whatever capacity or job role you are in, if we keep that, you know, mindset in play, then we should be able to begin to influence, or in this case, or in some cases, raise the question or raise the requirement, especially if you're in the tech industry, to say, hey, what about, you know, people who are challenged, whether cognitively, visually, you know, hearing wise, and how do we ensure that they are part of our thinking and also development and usage process.
Right, that so much of the promise of technology is that you can serve people no matter where they're coming from, whatever they might be experiencing in their life, whatever disability, you should be able to serve them. Technology gives us that opportunity and kind of level the playing field. Tom, a final thought from you?
Sure, just a last word on this. I think, speaking to the activists out there that are looking to make change, I think the real value for this conversation in this area is that in terms of the future of aging and in the future of trying to make the world a better place, there's a lot of action right here. This confluence of technology and aging, there's a lot of new stuff being developed. There are a lot of new learning opportunities. And what we're seeing is that companies, governments, institutions are coming to us and saying, how can we work with this topic? It's a problem that obviously COVID has brought to the forefront, but the healthcare industry and the telecommunications industry and transportation, it all runs together into how do we help older adults maximize technology to improve their lives. And as you develop expertise in it, you'll be able to tap into some of these emerging kind of opportunities and resources that are really starting to come together now. So it's an exciting time to be doing this work.
Oh, that's great to hear. And it's a great note on which to close this panel session. I know everybody following along around the world is joining me in thanking you, maybe virtually clapping in their kitchens or living rooms as they watch this. Thank you so much, all four of you, Francis West, Lourdes Montenegro, Matthias, Tom Camber. Thank you all so much for being a part of this. It's been a great discussion. And I want to welcome back to this virtual stage, Allison Bryant. And Allison, kind of speaking of action, Tom brought up this idea that this is a moment for action, and there's an opportunity here at the confluence of technology and an aging agenda to do something. You're a person of action. That's your role at AARP. What do you see as the opportunity here? What are we trying to get done?
Absolutely. Thanks, Raj. And thank you, panel. That was really fantastic. And I also want to thank all of the participants. This is probably the most active chat that I've been part of in one of these events, especially in a virtual setting. So I really appreciate it. This is really this is a critical issue for AARP. We have elevated this at AARP to what we call an issue area. So this is something that you're going to be seeing a lot more from us on. And really, we're seeing this event as a jumping off point for our global work to convene diverse organizations and perspectives around solving for digital inclusion and addressing digital equity in older persons. I think we heard such a great set of remarks earlier from the Assistant Secretary General, who really is leading a lot of this work from the UN, and they have a lot of things that are coming down the pike that we're excited to take a leading role on. And I also appreciate the fact that they are being very thoughtful in their approach to making sure that, first of all, older persons are certainly a considered set of folks, but that it's also children and women and displaced persons. So I think all of those are going to be really, really critical. So for our part, AARP is pledging to take a leadership role in the efforts that are put forth by the UN and others. I think we want to be a convener, but we also want to be bringing not just together organizations and people, but also solutions. And so that's something that we're sort of kicking off now. I think we understand that this is an ecosystem approach, and I thought we've heard some great comments about that, right? That this is not just about governments, this is about private sector, this is about NGOs all coming together to solve from this. And I think we've had some great insights today that I've got going in my mind as we consider how we're going to frame things moving forward and the kind of deliverables that we want to come back both to the UN, but also into civil society and into the industry. Some critical points, like even if we're focusing on older persons, we have to always consider intersectionalities, gender, geography, socioeconomic status. Those are differences that do make a difference when we think about this thing, these issues, and that we do have to break down this perspective of older adults versus the other. So bringing this idea of inclusivity, inclusive design, that's something that's critical. This is not just about having organizations, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit or government, just checking a box. We really need to be thinking inclusively. I think issues like needing to look at solutions in the not so usual spaces. I saw a lot of real fervor around intergenerational efforts to solve some of these. And I think there's some really great models out there, although also not without their challenges that we'll have to think about. And then how do we also piggyback on other efforts that are out there? I think that'll be great. So I've been so pleased to hear this conversation. I think there's great ideas we're looking to jump off with. And my big request is for those of you who are interested in being more of our conversation and our convenings moving forward, please reach out to me if you have best practices and learnings to share. And we are going to be building this network of organizations who are interested in solving these issues in the context of the UN's work. Please reach out to us. We look forward to working with you.
That's great to hear, Allison. I'm sure many people following along will do that. We'll reach out to you just based on the energy in the room. It's an issue that I think has struck a chord. We're happy to help highlight it here at Devex. You know, there's the sustainable development goals are a big part of what people are talking about. This is one of those that cuts across so many of them. It really is an opportunity, and it's great to get the chance to highlight it with so much expertise in our session today. So a big thanks to you, Allison, to ARP, our partner in this event, to all of you who've joined today. We appreciate it, and be well.